By the time the rain started tapping against the bedroom window, Emily Hart had already packed 3 boxes of her mother's life. The house on Sycamore Lane was too quiet. No television, no kettle whistling, just the old refrigerator humming in the kitchen and the creak of floorboards that suddenly seemed louder without her mother's footsteps. It was late October 2024, 30 years after the summer her family stopped talking about the lake. On top of the dresser, between a chipped jewelry tray and a stack of church bulletins gone yellow at the edges, Emily saw it. A thick, silver-gray laptop, the kind people stopped making a long time ago. A fading Post-it was stuck to the lid in her mother's handwriting. "Don't throw away. Family photos." Emily stood there for a moment, fingers resting on the plastic. Then she carried it to the kitchen table, plugged in the frayed power cord, and waited. The fan whined. The screen flickered. For a second, it looked like it might give up. Then the old operating system crawled to life. Her mother's name appeared on the login screen. Password. Emily almost smiled. Her mother had used the same one for everything. Maple 1990. Her fingers typed it automatically. She expected exactly what the note promised. Christmas pictures, school concerts, vacation photos, maybe a folder of work reports from the insurance office, maybe a recipe collection. Instead, she noticed a small icon in the corner of the desktop, an old cloud backup app, the logo almost worn away. She clicked it. A window opened with a list of folders. Most had boring names. Docs, Photos, Backup 2015. One stood out, labeled with a single word. Threads. Her heartbeat shifted. Inside were exported message histories from different phones and chat apps, little gray icons lined up in a column. Mom and Emily. Book Club. Church Ladies. Maple Ridge PTA. And one more. Mark, do not open. Her father's name. Emily's hand hovered over the trackpad. Mark Hart had been Maple Ridge's golden boy, volunteer paramedic, shift leader at the EMS station, the guy who showed up to every Little League game with a first aid kit and a cooler full of sports drinks. When he died of a heart attack 3 years earlier. At 55, Main Street had filled with blue and white ribbons. The paramedic units lined up outside the church. People called him a hero. Her mother had sobbed for weeks. Emily glanced at the date under the folder name. Exported June 2002. Original messages. May-July 1994. 1994. The year Aunt Hannah fell out of the rowboat on Maple Ridge Lake and never came home. Emily swallowed. Outside, the rain got louder, drumming on the roof. In the living room, the old clock chimed 3 times. She double-clicked. The thread opened. A simple log. Dates, timestamps, her mother's name on one side, her father's on the other. The first messages were harmless. Grocery lists, shift changes, complaints about the July heat. Then her eyes stopped on one line. You promised she'd be alone at the lake that night. Timestamp, July the 16th, 1994. 3:19 p.m. beneath it, her father's reply. She will be. Just make sure you're home by 9. I'll handle the rest. For a moment, Emily didn't understand the words. They sat on the screen like a sentence in a language she'd never seen before. Then her stomach dropped. She scrolled. Mark, I'm scared. What if something goes wrong? You want her out of your life, don't you? You said you were done with her always taking over. This is the only way we get our family back. Her fingers trembled on the trackpad. Further down, another line. Logged at 10:47 p.m. that same night. It's done. Call 911 in 5 minutes. Say you can't reach her. The kitchen tilted. Emily shoved the chair back so hard it scraped the linoleum. Her heart hammered in her throat. For a second, she thought she might be sick right there on the floor. For 30 years, everyone had called it an accident. A terrible, senseless accident on a warm July night. Now, on a flickering screen in a quiet kitchen, Emily was staring at something else. Instructions. A plan. proof that her parents had talked about sending Hannah to the lake alone and staging the call that started the search. When her older brother Daniel arrived an hour later, soaked from the rain and carrying takeout, Emily didn't let him put the bags down. "Sit," she said. "Just read." He sat. He read. By the time he reached, "It's done. Call 911 in 5 minutes," his face had gone gray. He stood up, paced the small kitchen, ran both hands through his hair, then grabbed his keys. "We're not the ones who should be reading this," he said. "The county needs to see it." 2 hours later, they were sitting in hard plastic chairs in a windowless office at the Fayette County Sheriff's Department. The laptop sat open on the desk between them and Detective Laura Mercado. Mercado had been a cop for 22 years, long enough to carry a pager, then a flip phone, then the smartphone that buzzed quietly next to her keyboard now. She had seen ugly things. She had never seen this. A preserved message thread from 1994 that read, line by line, like the blueprint for a killing at Maple Ridge Lake. She scrolled slowly, lips pressed into a thin line. She looked at, "You promised she'd be alone at the lake that night." She looked at, "This is the only way we get our family back." And finally, "It's done. Call 911 in 5 minutes." On the wall behind her, a whiteboard carried the names of her open cases. At the very bottom, in blue marker, one line she barely looked at anymore. Hannah Cohen, 7/16/94, possible accidental drowning, Maple Ridge Lake. She turned back to the screen and then to the incident report on her computer. The original 911 call from the Hart residence had come in at 10:53 p.m. The message, "It's done," was time-stamped, 10:47. 6 minutes. Jesus, Mercado breathed. In a town like Maple Ridge, old tragedies usually turned into stories people told in lowered voices at barbecues and funerals. Remember that girl at the lake? Such a shame. But this wasn't a story. These were words, typed in real time, by a husband and wife who had stood in the front pew at Hannah's funeral. Mercado looked at Emily and Daniel. They were adults now, but she could still see the outline of the children in the photographs clipped to the original file. The 5-year-old boy in a miniature baseball uniform, the 3-year-old girl with a bowl cut, clinging to her mother's leg. Fear hadn't changed much in 30 years. It still sat in their eyes the same way. "You understand," Mercado said quietly. "If this is real, it doesn't just change how we see your aunt's death. It changes everything about who your parents were." Emily stared at the laptop. "I don't know who they were anymore," she said. Mercado nodded once. Then she turned back to her computer. On the case screen for Hannah Cohen, she moved the mouse to Status and clicked. Closed, non-criminal. She switched it. Reopened, suspicious death. Then she picked up the phone and called the state crime lab in Harrisburg. "I've got an old laptop," she said to the analyst who answered. "Obsolete backup software, exported messages from 1994. It looks like they're talking about making a lake accident happen. I need someone to pull everything off this drive and tell me if what I'm seeing is real." As she hung up, the date on her monitor caught her eye. October 21st, 2024. If the messages were authentic, someone in Maple Ridge had walked free for 30 years after planning what the town had mourned as a tragic accident. To understand how that happened, she knew she had to go back to the beginning. Back to the summer of 1994, when Hannah Cohen was still alive. In 1994, Maple Ridge, Pennsylvania, was the kind of place you drove through on your way somewhere else and told people later, "Cute little town." Population, just under 9,000. 1 main street, 1 high school, 3 churches, a grocery store, a diner, a hardware store that sold everything from fishing lures to snow shovels. And at the center of it, like a mirror dropped in the middle of the hills, Maple Ridge Lake. It wasn't big. About 110 acres of man-made water, ringed by trees, rental cabins, and a public beach. On weekends, families spread blankets on the grass. Kids cannonballed off the dock. Someone always burned hot dogs on a grill. On weeknights, when the day trippers went home, the lake grew quiet. The water turned black and glassy. The only sounds were crickets and the occasional motor humming in the distance. Hannah Cohen loved that lake. She was 24 that summer, the younger of two sisters. The artsy one. She carried a sketchbook instead of a planner. Paint stained her fingers. After graduating from Maple Ridge High, she'd gone to community college, then to an art institute in Pittsburgh. Her plan was simple: spend the school year in the city, summers back home, saving money and filling sketchbooks. Eventually, she wanted a small studio on Main Street. Kids' art classes in the afternoon, her own canvases in the window. Her older sister, Rebecca, was the practical one. She worked at Maple Ridge Mutual Insurance. She was married to Mark Hart, a paramedic with the Maple Ridge EMS unit. They already had 2 kids, 5-year-old Daniel and 3-year-old Emily. On paper, the Harts were perfect. Mark worked long shifts on the ambulance, knew every back road by heart, and had a knack for making people feel safe in their worst moments. He coached t-ball. He organized CPR classes at the high school. If a neighbor's pipe burst at 2 in the morning, he was there with a wrench and a flashlight. Rebecca volunteered at church, baked for fundraisers, and kept her desk so tidy that her boss used it as an example. If Maple Ridge needed something done, the Harts were usually on the list. Hannah floated between their world and her own. She spent her days that summer working part-time at the lakeside rental counter, handing out keys and life jackets. In the evenings, she sat on the dock in an oversized denim jacket, bare feet dangling over the water, sketching the way the trees reflected on the surface. People liked her. She was easy to talk to. She babysat. She helped out at the lake cleanup days. She hugged her sister's kids every time she came by. To most of the town, she was Rebecca's younger sister. To one person, she was a problem. More than one neighbor noticed the way Mark's eyes lingered on Hannah when she walked into a room, how his laugh got a little louder when she laughed, how he watched her car leave at night from the front porch, hands in his pockets, gaze fixed on the taillights until they disappeared. In a small town, people notice things. They just don't always say them out loud. July 16, 1994 was a Saturday. The afternoon temperature hit 86 degrees. The air felt like warm bath water. By evening, the sky had settled into that deep blue that comes just before dark, with a smear of orange fading over the tree line. At 7:12 p.m., according to the handwritten log taped to the marina counter, Hannah signed out a small aluminum rowboat and 1 life jacket. The 17-year-old clerk, a bored kid named Mike Patterson, slid the clipboard toward her without looking up at first. She joked about needing to capture the light just right. He grunted, stamped the time, and reminded her to have the boat back by 10. At 7:30, a family eating dinner on the deck of cabin 4 saw her push off from the dock. She waved when one of the kids shouted her name. At 8:05, a couple walking the path on the far side of the lake noticed a lone boat near the tree line, a figure in the bow hunched over what looked like a sketchbook. After that, no one could say for sure. Back in town, Rebecca and Mark were putting the kids to bed. Cartoons clicked off. Toothbrushes ran. A box fan roared softly in the bedroom they shared. At 9:15 p.m., Rebecca called the rental office to check if Hannah had returned the boat. No answer. At 9:32, she tried again. Still no answer. The machine picked up with Mike's recorded voice, telling callers to leave a message after the beep. At 9:47, she paged Hannah. No callback. There is a moment in every missing person story when worry crosses an invisible line and becomes fear. For Rebecca, that moment came a little after 10, when she stared at the empty driveway, the dark shape of the hills beyond town, and felt something cold and hard slide into place under her ribs. At 10:53 p.m., the Fayette County 911 Center received a call from the Hart residence. The caller was Mark. The recording still exists. His voice sounded tight, but controlled, as he told the dispatcher his sister-in-law was overdue from the lake, that she'd taken a rowboat out alone, that his wife was beside herself. He asked for a welfare check and a search. Within 20 minutes, 2 sheriff's deputies, a game warden, and a volunteer firefighter were at Maple Ridge Lake. They found Hannah's car in the gravel lot, keys on the front seat, a damp towel and sandals tossed in the back. The rowboat was not at the dock. Flashlights cut through the darkness. A small patrol boat spotlight swept the water. The air smelled like algae, wet wood, and gasoline. Crickets went silent when the engine started, as if even the insects understood something was wrong. Just before midnight, a volunteer spotted the missing boat. It drifted about 200 yards from shore, half-turned. One oar floated nearby. The life jacket lay in the middle bench, tangled and unused. There was no sign of Hannah. By 2 in the morning, portable floodlights turned the dock into a harsh white stage. Volunteers lined the shore, shoulder to shoulder, sweeping the shallows with their beams. They found nothing. At dawn, a dive team from the next county arrived. The water was murky, cold beneath the surface. Divers moved in a grid, hands sweeping the lake bed. At 9:17 a.m., one of them surfaced and shouted. They had found her. Hannah lay in about 12 feet of water, 15 feet from where the rowboat had been. Shorts, t-shirt, hair drifting around her face like weeds. There were no ropes, no anchors, no obvious wounds. The coroner's first impression was simple: drowning. By noon, Maple Ridge knew. The girl from the rental desk, the artist on the dock, the one who painted the lake. Gone. At the Cohen house, Rebecca collapsed on the couch and sobbed until her chest hurt. Her parents sat in stunned silence, the sound of neighbors' footsteps and casseroles arriving, filling the gaps where words should have been. Mark did what a paramedic does. He moved. He made phone calls. He coordinated with the sheriff's office. He stood in the kitchen refilling coffee cups and saying the phrases everyone says when there's no good reason. "I'm so sorry. If only we'd known sooner. At least she died doing something she loved." No one knew that 6 minutes before he dialed 911, he had sent his wife a message. It's done. The official investigation into Hannah Cohen's death lasted just under 3 weeks. On paper, it looked thorough enough. Deputies interviewed more than 20 people. The marina clerk, the family in cabin 4, the couple who'd seen the lone boat, Hannah's co-workers, her family. They noted the clear weather, the light wind, the water temperature. They sketched the approximate positions of the boat and the body. The autopsy report listed the cause of death as drowning. No broken bones, no obvious signs of a fight. A slightly elevated blood alcohol level, consistent with a few beers. A line near the bottom mentioned small bruises on her upper arm and wrist that could be consistent with impact against the boat. No one pressed on that line. Rebecca's timeline was solid. Neighbors saw her at home with the children. She answered a phone call from her mother at 9:40 p.m. from the kitchen. 2 separate people remembered hearing the kids splashing in the bath. Mark's alibi was thinner, but still accepted. He said he'd been on call for EMS, driving around to clear his head, pager on his belt, radio on the seat. No one could say they'd seen his car at the lake. There were no cameras in the parking lot, no license plate readers, no GPS logs. In 1994, in a rural county, a young woman alone on a lake, an overturned rowboat, and a strong swimmer who didn't make it to shore. It all added up to something people understood. A tragic accident. 3 weeks later, the sheriff held a short press briefing. He called the death heartbreaking. He said there was no evidence of foul play. The file was marked accordingly, and slid onto a shelf in the records room. Case closed. On the death certificate, under manner of death, one word was typed: accident. For the Cohen family, it never felt that simple. For years, they avoided the lake, the diner where Hannah used to sketch, the shelves with watercolor sets in the store. But pain needs a label, and accident was the one the town gave them. Life moved on. It always does. Grief does not disappear. It just learns to sit in a corner and wait. For Hannah's parents, life shrank to a few streets and routines: doctor visits, church, the grocery store. They aged, their backs curved, the light in their house dimmed. Rebecca became the bridge between them and the world. She handled their forms and bills. She kept a shoebox in her closet with Hannah's letters and sketches and the folded missing poster that had been printed before anyone knew to stop searching the surface and start searching the bottom. Mark seemed to carry his grief differently. He rarely said Hannah's name. When he did, the sadness looked appropriate. His voice broke in the right places. His eyes got wet. But some people noticed something else behind it: a tightness that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite grief. Something harder to name. He threw himself into work. He took extra shifts. He responded to calls he technically didn't have to. He rushed toward other people's emergencies like he could outrun his own. Inside the Hart house, the cracks showed where the town couldn't see. Emily grew up hearing muffled arguments behind closed doors. Words like her, that night, promise, floated through thin walls. Sometimes the phone rang in the middle of a fight, and Mark's voice flipped in a heartbeat, from sharp to soothing, as he answered as shift supervisor. Once, when Emily was 16, she went downstairs after midnight to get a glass of water and found her mother at the kitchen table, shoulders hunched, staring at a photograph. It was Hannah, standing on the dock at Maple Ridge Lake, wind in her hair, smile wide, water glittering behind her. Rebecca slid the picture back into the shoebox like she'd been caught with something illegal. "We don't leave this out," she whispered. "It upsets your grandparents." Then she wiped her eyes and told Emily to go back to bed. Years blurred. The Cohen parents grew frail and passed away. Mark climbed the EMS ladder, eventually becoming a supervisor over the entire region. Emily and Daniel moved out, started their own lives. The story of Hannah's accident turned into something people mentioned with a sigh. Such a shame. In June 2024, at 60, Rebecca Hart died of an aggressive cancer. The church was full again. People stood up and called her steady, kind, strong. More than one person mentioned Hannah in their eulogies, as if folding both losses into one neat, tragic narrative. No one mentioned the word threads. No one mentioned an old laptop. No one mentioned a message that read, "It's done. Call 911 in 5 minutes." Those words were still waiting, buried in a machine on Sycamore Lane, waiting for someone to press open. 2 days after Detective Mercado changed the case status on her screen, the Hart laptop arrived at the State Crime Lab in Harrisburg. Digital forensics analyst Jordan Patel handled dozens of devices every month. Most were new: smartphones, tablets, laptops, no older than 5 years. The Hart laptop looked like it belonged in a museum. "This thing is a dinosaur," he muttered, easing off the back panel. He cloned the hard drive, created a forensic image, and let his software crawl through the data. The backup app that held the message exports was obsolete, its company long out of business, but the raw files were there. Patel pulled everything dated May through August 1994 and fed it into a recovery tool. Deleted fragments stitched themselves back together. Hidden drafts surfaced. Even unsent messages, removed from view in the old app, left fingerprints in the data. One unsent draft, time-stamped 9:58 p.m. on July 16, 1994, made him sit back in his chair. She fought harder than I thought. Another at 11:12 p.m. If anyone asks, I was driving routes. You were home. We never talked about going to the lake. Patel felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. He checked the system clock logs. They lined up with the known times from the sheriff's incident report. No signs of tampering, no future timestamps, nothing to suggest this had been edited later. He compiled the recovered messages into a clean, chronological document, highlighted the key lines, and added a short note. Messages authentic. Timestamps consistent with 1994 system clock. Strong indicators of premeditation and cover story. Recommend full homicide investigation. In Maple Ridge, Mercado printed the report and laid it out across her desk. Old crime scene photos of the dock and the rowboat, the autopsy report, the thin original witness statements. And now, a digital conversation that read less like grief and more like planning. She drew a timeline on a yellow legal pad. 7:12 p.m. Hannah signs out the boat. 8:05 p.m. Last confirmed sighting. 10:47 p.m. It's done. Call 911 in 5 minutes. 10:53 p.m. 911 call from Mark Hart. After midnight. Boat found. 9:17 a.m. Body recovered. She circled the 6-minute gap. Then she walked to the bulletin board in the squad room and pinned up 2 photos. Hannah Cohen, 24, smiling at the lake. Mark Hart, from a 2019 newspaper article, in his paramedic uniform, accepting a plaque for 25 years of dedicated service. She drew a red line between their faces. Okay, she said quietly. Let's see who really remembers July 16th. Over the next week, she and Detective Chris Morales went door to door. They found the former marina clerk, now an auto parts manager with a receding hairline and a family of his own. He remembered Hannah. He remembered the boat. He remembered stamping the log. They tracked down the couple from cabin 4. They were divorced now, living in different states, but both recalled the girl in the rowboat and the way the searchlights cut across their deck that night. They talked to people who had owned cabins back then, fishermen who still used the lake, neighbors who'd lived near the access road in the 90s. Most had fragments, impressions, a hot night, flashing lights, the sick feeling that comes when you hear someone young has died. One man had more. Frank Dalton, a retired game warden with a clear gaze and a slow way of talking, sat at his kitchen table with the lake framed in the window behind him. I remember that night, he said. Not the search, earlier. He leaned back, eyes narrowing with concentration. I was driving past the access road around 9:30, saw a truck pull in, EMS logo on the side. I remember thinking, that's odd. We don't usually see an ambulance up here unless something's already wrong. Did you see who was driving? Mercado asked. Not his face, Dalton said. But he walked down toward the docks like he'd been there 100 times, not like a stranger. He hesitated. A memory shifted into focus. And the next morning, he added, when they brought the girl up, that paramedic, Mark, I think, he was already there, before the divers, before some of the deputies. I remember thinking, he got here fast. Back in the car, Mercado sat behind the wheel and stared at the notes on her pad. A young woman alone on a dark lake, a brother-in-law with a truck, a key ring, and every excuse in the world to be anywhere at any time. Messages that read like orders. An unsent draft that admitted she fought. 6 minutes between "it's done" and the call that turned him back into a hero. Her phone buzzed with an email from the district attorney's office asking for an update on the old drowning. She looked at Hannah's photo on the seat beside her. For 30 years, Maple Ridge had believed a simple story. A girl went out on the lake. She slipped. She drowned. Now, in the glow of a laptop screen and the ink of recovered messages, that story was cracking. They weren't looking at an accident anymore. They were closing in on the possibility that the man who organized fundraisers in Hannah's memory, the man who held her parents' hands at the funeral, the man who raised his children in the shadow of her death, had been the one who held her under the water. The problem with monsters who die early is simple. They think the truth dies with them. Mark Hart had been in the ground for 3 years when the state crime lab finished with his laptop. Dead. Buried. Honored. His picture still hung on the wall at the Maple Ridge EMS station. A framed photo of him in uniform. A plaque underneath that read, 25 years of dedicated service. On a Tuesday afternoon, Detective Laura Mercado stood under that frame with a plain manila envelope in her hand and felt something almost like vertigo. Because inside the envelope was the opposite story. The report from the lab in Harrisburg was only 8 pages long. 8 pages that turned a tragic accident into a planned killing. 8 pages that said, in simple language, what nobody in Maple Ridge had been willing to say out loud for 30 years. This was never an accident. It was a homicide. And the man on the wall had done it. Mercado drove straight from the station to the district attorney's office. The DA, a careful man named Brian Keller, read the report once, then again. He stopped on the recovered drafts. She fought harder than I thought. If anyone asks, I was driving Roots. You were home. We never talked about going to the lake. He put the pages down and rubbed his face with both hands. So, our primary suspect is dead, he said quietly. And his co-conspirator is dead. The victim's parents are dead. There is no one left to arrest. Mercado nodded. This isn't about an arrest anymore, she said. It's about the record. It's about the family. And it's about this town finally knowing what actually happened on that lake. Keller looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he sighed. Okay, he said. We do it properly. We reopen officially. We classify it as homicide. And we make it clear, on paper, that Mark and Rebecca Hart were responsible for the death of Hannah Cohen, even if we will never see a jury verdict. He picked up a pen and wrote 3 words across the old case summary. Cause, homicide. Then he scheduled a press conference. He knew exactly what was going to happen when those 3 words and that familiar name hit the air. The whole town was going to flinch, and 2 people were going to have their world torn in half. Their names were Emily and Daniel Hart. The children the killer had tucked into bed the night their aunt died. The ones who now had to live with the truth that their father and mother had planned a murder together. Mercado didn't tell them about the press conference first. She drove back to Sycamore Lane and knocked on the front door. The house looked even smaller than it had the first time she'd been there. Same sagging porch, same overgrown bushes. The difference was inside. More boxes. More empty shelves. Emily opened the door, her hair pulled back, a smudge of dust on her cheek. Daniel stood behind her, arms crossed, jaw tight. They didn't offer coffee. They didn't make small talk. They just watched her sit at the same kitchen table where they'd first opened the laptop. Just tell us, Emily said. No softening it. No detective talk. We can't do that today. Mercado spread the copy of the lab report between them. She talked them through it point by point. The timestamps, the drafts, the alignment with the 911 call, the fact that no one had altered the files, the conclusion from the state. The messages were real. There was no technical way to explain them away. Then she told them what the DA had decided. We're reclassifying your aunt's death as a homicide, she said. Our findings will state clearly that we believe your father physically caused her death and your mother helped plan it and cover it up. Silence filled the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. Rain pattered softly on the window. Daniel stared at the table. His hands shook. So that's it, he said finally. They killed her. And then they raised us. And then they died. And now they're just names on a piece of paper? Mercado didn't answer right away. She couldn't give him what he really wanted. "Legally," she said, "this is as far as we can go. They can't be indicted. They can't be tried. There won't be a perp walk or a sentencing hearing, but the record will show what happened. It won't say accident anymore. Not for Hannah. Not for any of you." Emily's eyes stayed on the report. "Will people know?" she asked. "Or does this just sit in a drawer again?" "We're going public," Mercado said. "The DA will hold a press conference. Local news will cover it. Probably some regional outlets too. You can speak if you want. You don't have to. But I'm not burying this in a file room." Emily let out a long, shaky breath. "For 30 years, she said, every time I told someone how my aunt died, I called it an accident. I thought I was honoring what she'd want, not making things worse for my parents. Turns out I've been repeating his lie for 3 decades. She closed her eyes. "When they read her name on TV, she said, I want it to be with the right word." Daniel looked at Mercado. "What word is that?" he asked. Mercado didn't look away. "Victim," she said. They held the press conference on a Wednesday. The county courthouse steps smelled like rain and old stone. A cluster of microphones stood on a metal podium, wires snaking down like roots. Local TV vans lined the street. Satellite dishes turned toward a gray sky. A few curious townspeople gathered on the sidewalk. Deputies stood at the edges, arms folded. Someone from the EMS station was there in uniform. Someone else from the church. A reporter from Pittsburgh sat up further back, checking his audio levels. When D.A. Keller stepped up to the microphones, he didn't waste time. 30 years ago, he began, this county lost a young woman named Hannah Cohen in what was believed to be a tragic lake accident on Maple Ridge Lake. He paused. Papers rustled softly. Today, based on newly recovered digital evidence and a reinvestigation of the case, we are formally reclassifying her death as a homicide. A murmur rolled through the small crowd. Camera shutters clicked. Keller continued. Our investigation has found strong, corroborated evidence that Hannah Cohen's brother-in-law, the late Mark Hart, intentionally caused her death in the waters of Maple Ridge Lake on the night of July 16, 1994. We have also found evidence that his wife, the late Rebecca Hart, participated in planning and covering up this crime. He didn't soften the words. There was no way to make them gentle. He described the messages, the timestamps, the recovered drafts. He emphasized that experts had verified the data, that the messages had lined up with the original 911 timeline. He explained that no charges could be filed because both primary actors were deceased, that there would be no trial, that some people would hear this news and feel angry. Others would feel betrayed. Others would refuse to believe it at all. That is their right, he said. But it is my responsibility to state, clearly, what the evidence shows. For the record. For Hannah. And for her surviving family. He stepped back. A reporter from the local station called out the question everyone was thinking. Are you saying the same man this community honored as a hero? She pointed toward a small group of EMS personnel standing on the edge of the crowd. Is now officially a murder suspect? Keller didn't flinch. I'm saying, he replied, that records can be wrong, stories can be wrong, and that sometimes the person we put on the wall under the word hero did something unforgivable when no one was watching. He nodded toward the steps. Emily and Daniel Hart have chosen to make a brief statement, he said. I ask that you respect the limits they've set and not push for more today. Emily had never liked being the center of attention. As a kid, she'd hidden behind her mother's leg when strangers came over. As an adult, she preferred the back row, the corner seat, the angle where she could see everyone and no one could see her. But when she walked up to the microphones that day, the cameras pointing at her, she didn't shake. Her brother stood beside her, a quiet wall of support. She unfolded a single sheet of paper and took a breath. "My name is Emily Hart," she said. "This is my brother, Daniel. Hannah Cohen was our aunt. Mark and Rebecca Hart were our parents." A car passed in the distance. A siren wailed somewhere blocks away and faded. "For 30 years, Emily said, we believed what we were told, that our aunt died in a tragic accident on the lake, that our parents did everything they could, that what happened that night was a horrible mistake no one could have prevented." Her voice tightened, but she did not stop. "Now we know that wasn't true." She didn't describe the messages. She didn't quote, "It's done." She didn't mention the unsent draft about how hard Hannah had fought. That was theirs. Private. Poison they would carry themselves. But she did say this: "Our parents did things we can never defend. They hurt people we loved. They lied to us, to this town, and to themselves." She looked straight into the camera lenses. "We can't change what they did," she said. "We can only decide what we do with the truth. And for us, that means saying Hannah's name, not as the girl who had an accident, but as a woman who was killed and deserves to be remembered honestly." She folded the paper. "We are grateful to Detective Mercado, to the district attorney, and to everyone who helped bring the truth into the light," she said. "We ask that you remember Hannah for who she was, not for what was done to her. And we ask that you give us, and our children, the space to grieve our aunt, and the parents we thought we had." She stepped back. Questions flew from the crowd. "Do you hate your father? Do you think your mother was afraid of him? Will you change your last name? Do you think the EMS station should take his plaque down?" Emily didn't answer. She turned away from the microphones and walked down the steps with Daniel, the TV cameras tracking them until they disappeared into the courthouse. The shock in Maple Ridge came in waves. The first wave hit the EMS station. Paramedics and EMTs stood in the hallway, eyes on the mounted television, watching their former supervisor's name appear under the word homicide. Some swore out loud. Some shook their heads. Some said there had to be a mistake. One younger EMT looked up at the framed photo of Mark on the wall, then at the crawl on the TV, then back at the photo. "I took my patch from this guy," he whispered. "He taught me how to do chest compressions on a baby. He bought my kid a bike when she broke her arm. And now you're telling me he drowned his own sister-in-law?" Nobody had a good answer. At the church, where Rebecca had brought casseroles and Hannah had once sat sketching stained glass windows, the reaction was more hushed, but just as intense. Some parishioners refused to believe it at all. "Messages can be faked," one woman insisted. "The devil wants to tear down good men's names." Others, especially those who had seen the way Mark watched Hannah that last summer, said nothing at all. They just stared at the floor and let realization sink in. At the diner, the regulars argued over coffee. "I knew something was off about that night," an older man said. "Who gets to a scene that fast without being close by?" "I don't care what they say," another snorted. "Mark saved more lives than any of us. You don't erase that because of some old texts." "Some old texts that talk about making sure she's alone on the lake," the first man shot back. "Did you even listen?" At the lake itself, the news felt heavier. People walked past the dock where Hannah had pushed off that last evening and shivered. The water looked different now. Colder. Less innocent. Parents held their kids' hands a little tighter near the edge. At the sheriff's department, Mercado watched the town react and felt something complicated in her chest. Satisfaction that the truth was finally out. Sadness that it had taken this long. And anger that the man at the center of it all would never sit in a courtroom and hear a jury say the word guilty. One afternoon, a deputy walked into her office holding an EMS plaque and a frame. "They're asking what to do with these," he said. The photo showed Mark shaking hands with the mayor, receiving a certificate for outstanding service above and beyond the call of duty. Mercado looked at the plaque, then at the trash can. "Bag them," she said. "Evidence room. One day, someone's going to write a book about this town, and they're going to ask what he looked like." She paused. "And when they do, I want his face to come with context." 2 weeks after the press conference, when the chaos had settled into a dull background hum of rumors and arguments, Emily and Daniel drove out to Maple Ridge Lake. It was late afternoon. The water was flat and dark, the September air cooler now, a hint of fall in the breeze. They parked in the gravel lot where Hannah's car had once sat. They walked down the same path she had taken to the dock. A new sign had gone up on a wooden post at the trailhead, installed quietly by the county in the days after the reclassification. It read, "In memory of Hannah Cohen, 1970-1994. Loved daughter, sister, aunt, friend. Her life matters. Her truth matters." Emily stopped and traced the letters with her fingertips. "Do you think she'd want this?" she asked. Daniel shrugged, eyes on the water. "I think she'd want something other than accident on her file," he said. "This is better than nothing." They walked to the end of the dock and sat, legs dangling over the edge, just like Hannah had done in the photos. For a long time, they didn't speak. Eventually, Emily reached into her bag and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. It was one of Hannah's old paintbrushes, the wood worn smooth, the metal band tarnished, the bristles stained with dried blue paint. "I found it in Mom's shoebox," Emily said, "with the letters and that dock picture." She held it over the water. "For 30 years, she said softly, "we thought your story ended because of a mistake, because someone didn't stand up in the boat right, because life is random and cruel." Her voice shook. "Now we know that's not true. It's worse. It wasn't random. It wasn't a mistake. Someone chose it. Someone we loved." She took a breath. "But that also means this. You weren't clumsy. You weren't stupid. You didn't do this to yourself. You fought. Harder than he expected." She thought of the unsent draft recovered from the laptop. "She fought harder than I thought." "I'm sorry it took us 30 years to see you," Emily whispered. "Really see you. Not as a tragedy, not as an accident, but as a person who deserved better than all of us." She let the paintbrush fall. It hit the surface with barely a sound, then began to sink, a faint shadow drifting down into the dark. Beside her, Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "What do we do now?" he asked. Emily watched the ripples fade. "We live with it," she said. "We tell our kids the truth. We stop pretending monsters only live under beds and not at our own kitchen tables. And we remember that the person who hurt her most didn't erase everything she was." She stood up and looked out over the lake. "For 30 years, the story in this town was simple," she said. "Girl goes out on the water. Girl slips. Girl drowns. End of story." She turned back toward the shore, toward the small sign with Hannah's name. "Now there's a new story," she said. "Girl goes out on the water. Someone she trusts holds her under. The town believes a lie. And decades later, her own family opens a laptop and finally drags the truth into the light." She let out a long breath. "It doesn't fix anything," she said, "but it's real." As they walked back up the dock, the water behind them looked the same as it always had. Calm. Dark. Beautiful in a way that hid what lay below. But on the trailhead, a sign now said, in quiet letters, that Hannah Cohen's life and truth mattered. And in a records room in the county courthouse, a file that once said, "accidental drowning," now carried a different word. Homicide. The hero on the wall would always be part of Maple Ridge history. But so would the messages he thought no one would ever read. And somewhere in that balance, between the man people thought they knew and the man the evidence revealed lived the real story. Not about how a girl died, but about how long a town can live with a lie until someone finally presses open.